The dust hung heavy over Sandstone Bluff's main street, like a funeral shroud stirred by cattle hooves and the boots of men who claimed dominion over everything beneath them. Through the haze, Cora Whitfield stumbled from behind the wooden water barrels near Garrett's general store, her blue calico dress torn at the shoulder and stained dark with blood that hadn't yet dried. At 20, she had arrived from Pennsylvania 3 weeks prior, with dreams of frontier teaching. But now she moved like a wounded animal, one trembling hand pressed against her ribs, where crimson seeped through the fabric. Well, drawled rough Rick from his sorrel saddle, his voice carrying the lazy malice of a snake coiled in summer shade. The ranch hand's weathered face split into a cold grin as his thumb traced the ivory grip of his Colt. Looks like our little Eastern Rose got herself into some real trouble. Makes a man wonder what kind of activities she was conducting back there, all alone and accommodating like. The crowd along the boardwalk shifted uneasily, whispers rising and falling like prairie wind. Mrs. Garrett clutched her apron strings, muttering to the baker's wife about what happens when proper young ladies forget their station. 3 men near Murphy's saloon adjusted their weight hands, drifting toward their weapons. The whether to help or hinder remained as murky as the dust-choked air. Near Morrison's leather goods, a Cheyenne trader named Dasan swung down from his paint pony with fluid grace. 25 years had carved his face into sharp planes and angles, his black hair braided with strips of rawhide, his deerskin trousers and faded cotton shirt marking him as someone who walked the narrow path between 2 worlds. He'd come to trade winter pelts for ammunition and salt, a monthly ritual that kept an uneasy peace with townsfolk who tolerated his presence like a necessary evil. But something had shifted in the air today, something that made his hand drift toward the Spencer carbine slung across his shoulders. Cora's knees buckled, and she pitched toward the dusty street. Without conscious thought, Dasan crossed the 20 yards between them in heartbeats. His calloused hands found the worst gash along her ribs, pressing firmly but gently as her blood seeped between his fingers. The crowd's murmur shifted, turning ominous as a gathering storm. Pain is life calling out, he said quietly, his voice steady despite the hostility crackling around them. Listen to that voice. Let it keep you strong. Her breathing came in sharp gasps, but her green eyes found his kind eyes. She realized through the shock an unexpected thing in this harsh place, where kindness often meant death. Rick's boots hit dirt with deliberate thuds as he dismounted. Now ain't this just precious red man getting mighty cozy with white women? His thumb worked the hammer with practiced ease. That kind of intimacy don't sit well with decent folk. Don't sit well at all. Old Henrik Dahl pushed through the gathering, his weathered hands visible and non-threatening. The Norwegian farmer's land bordered the creek, and he'd traded with Dasan before. Rick, he said in his careful English, touched with the musical accent of his homeland. The girl, she needs help, not more trouble. Even a stubborn goat knows when to stop butting heads, yeah. Dr. Samuel Pike elbowed past the townsfolk, his medical bag clutched tight in one liver-spotted hand. At 50, he'd seen enough frontier violence to recognize its aftermath. Stand aside, the lot of you. Can't you see she's hurt badly? But Rick's attention had fixed on Dasan like a hawk spotting prey. I asked you a question, Chief. You deaf as well as savage. The revolver's hammer clicked back with metallic finality. Women gasped. Men began choosing sides with the subtle shifts that preceded bloodshed. Dr. Pike continued his approach, but even he slowed at the sight of drawn iron. Cora tried to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't. What's that, darling? Rick leaned closer, his weapon still trained on Dasan. Speak up so we can all hear what happened back there in the shadows. He didn't hurt me. The words cut through the noise like a blade. Someone else, behind the barrels? with a knife. Rick's expression flickered just for an instant, but Dasan caught it. Something passed across the ranch hand's face that wasn't quite surprise. More like a man calculating odds and finding them suddenly unfavorable. The gun bucked in Rick's hand, but he'd aimed into the dirt just inches from Dasan's knee. The warning shot scattered the crowd like startled quail, but a wooden splinter kicked up by the bullet sliced across Cora's shoulder, adding fresh blood to her torn dress. Dasan didn't flinch. Instead, he pressed himself more firmly between her and the smoking barrel, his body a shield against whatever might come next. His hand found hers and squeezed once, a gesture of reassurance that somehow steadied them both. Next one won't be a warning. Rick promised, his voice carrying the conviction of a man accustomed to getting his way through violence. But the crowd was watching now, truly watching, and some didn't like what they saw. A young woman bleeding in the street, a man offering help, and another man threatening to shoot them both. Henrik Dahl took another step forward. "Rick, put the gun away before someone gets hurt who don't deserve it." Dr. Pike's voice carried decades of authority. This girl was attacked, recently, violently. She needs medical attention, not more threats. Rick's eyes darted between the faces surrounding him, reading the subtle shift in the crowd's mood. His moment of absolute power was slipping away, like water through cupped hands. Cora squeezed Dasan's hand back, her grip stronger than he'd expected. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly despite its weakness. "He saved my life." The words settled over the street like dust after a storm. Rick's weapon wavered slightly, his confidence shaken by the simple declaration. "This ain't finished," he muttered, but the gun went back to half cock and then slid into its holster. Not by a long shot. As he swung back into his saddle and spurred his horse toward the edge of town, Dr. Pike began cleaning Cora's wounds with water from his bag. Dasan remained kneeling beside her, both aware they had just survived the first test of many to come. 3 days earlier, Cora had stepped off the weekly freight wagon with a carpet bag full of teaching certificates and dreams of frontier opportunity. The advertisement in the Philadelphia Inquirer had promised educational opportunities in the growing territory and respectable employment for qualified young ladies. What it hadn't mentioned was that Bertram Sloan, the man who'd placed the ad, had no intention of letting her teach anywhere. Sloan owned the Crow Wing Ranch, 15,000 acres of prime grazing land that stretched from Sandstone Bluff to the foothills of the Badger Mountains. At 52, he had built his empire through shrewd business sense and ruthless elimination of obstacles. When he'd learned that Cora's deceased parents had left her a small inheritance and legal claim to water rights along Green Valley Creek, he'd crafted a plan as simple as it was effective. Bring her west under the pretense of employment, establish dubious wardship papers, and a coerced power of attorney under territorial law, and control her assets until a marriage could be arranged with his nephew. The fact that Cora had proven intelligent enough to keep detailed books and ask pointed questions about ranch finances had been an unwelcome complication. So had her habit of taking evening walks around town, during which she might have observed things better left unnoticed. Now, as Dr. Pike wrapped clean linen around Cora's ribs in the back room of his surgery, she found herself drawn into something far more complex than simple employment fraud. "The cut's clean," Dr. Pike was saying, his skilled hands gentle but thorough. "Made with a sharp knife, not a broken bottle or rough edge. Whoever did this knew how to use a blade." Cora winced as he tightened the bandage. "I fought back. Got his spur rowel with a barrel stave before he could finish what he started." "Before he what?" Pike's voice was carefully neutral. "Before he said I'd been asking for trouble walking around like I owned the place. Said Eastern girls needed to learn frontier manners the hard way." Her voice grew harder. said there were worse things than a knife cut for girls who didn't know their place. Dasan, who had been standing quietly near the window keeping watch, turned at her words. You recognized his voice. She shook her head carefully. No, but he smelled like tobacco and horse sweat. Expensive tobacco, the kind rich men smoke. And his spurs, they had fancy engravings. Silver work, elaborate. Dr. Pike caught Dawson's eye and nodded toward the front room. Miss Whitfield needs rest. Why don't we let her have some quiet? In the surgery's main room, Pike closed the door carefully before speaking in low tones. I've seen enough frontier violence to know when someone's lying about what happened to them. That girl was telling the truth, every word. The man with the gun, Rick. He knew something more than he was saying. Rick Harmon works for Bertram Sloan. Has for near 3 years now. Pike's weathered face was stone. He's got a reputation for handling Sloan's difficult problems. Problems that need solving with more than words. Problems like stolen horses. Pike's eyebrows rose. Your horses? 3 of them. In Sloan's corral behind Morrison's feed store. Taken from my people's winter camp 2 nights past. The doctor moved to his medicine cabinet with unnecessary care. Dasan, I've known you for 2 years now. You've always dealt fair and honest with this town. But Bertram Sloan owns most of the grazing land hereabouts, and he's got connections that reach all the way to the territorial capital. I'm thinking of protecting my people, and maybe protecting that girl from whoever hurt her. Pike's hand stilled on the bottles. You think they're connected, the horses and the attack? A man who steals horses might not draw the line at other crimes, especially if he thinks he's above consequences. The front door opened and Henrik Dahl entered, his worn felt hat in his weathered hands. The Norwegian farmer looked older than his 45 years, worn down by prairie weather and harder times, but his blue eyes held steady resolve. Dr. Pike. Dasan. Henrik nodded to each in turn. I heard there was trouble in the street today. Miss Whitfield was attacked, Pike said simply. Behind Garrett's store. Henrik's jaw tightened. Attacked how badly? Knife work. Could have been killed if Dasan hadn't found her when he did. The farmer studied Dasan with careful assessment. You know who did this terrible thing. Not yet, but I know where my stolen horses are grazing. Henrik's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Sloan's corral. You've seen them. Saw Deputy Miles leading them through town yesterday evening. Thought it was strange, 3 Indian ponies with that star brand. Miles, he don't usually handle livestock. Deputy U.S. Marshal Miles Garrett was nephew to the store owner and cousin to half the town council. He supplemented his meager law enforcement salary by running errands for anyone willing to pay, and Bertram Sloan paid better than most. Miles was in town yesterday evening, Pike mused. Same evening Miss Whitfield was attacked. The 3 men exchanged meaningful glances as the implications settled between them. Horse theft, assault, and corruption were common enough on the frontier, but their combination suggested something larger and more dangerous. A soft knock interrupted their thoughts. Miss Lucinda Park entered carrying a basket covered with gingham cloth. At 30, she was one of the few unmarried women in Sandstone Bluff who had achieved independence through her teaching position. Her brown hair was pinned severely back, and her gray wool dress was practical, but her hazel eyes held intelligence that made some of the town's men uncomfortable. Dr. Pike, I brought some broth for Miss Whitfield. She glanced at Dasan and Henrik with curiosity rather than suspicion. How is she faring? She's healing, though she's had quite a shock. I imagine so. It's terrible what happened. Lucinda's voice carried genuine concern. I saw Deputy Miles riding hard toward the Crow Wing Ranch right after all the commotion died down. Seemed in quite a hurry. Another round of meaningful looks passed between the men. If Miles had ridden directly to Sloane after the street confrontation, it suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Miss Park, Dasan said carefully. When you saw the deputy riding out, did you notice anything unusual about his appearance? She thought for a moment. He seemed disheveled. His hat was crooked and there was dirt on his jacket. Fresh dirt like he'd been scuffling with someone. And he was favoring his left leg when he mounted his horse, had to use the mounting block, muttering something about Eastern bitches under his breath. Favoring it, how? Like he'd hurt his ankle or shin, limping some. Pike nodded slowly. Miss Whitfield said she fought back, got her attacker with a barrel stave. Right around the ankle area, Dasan added. Lucinda's eyes widened as the pieces fell together. You think Deputy Miles? We think Miss Whitfield interrupted something she wasn't supposed to see, Henrik said quietly. And someone decided to silence her permanent-like. The weight of the accusation settled over them like a heavy blanket. Accusing a deputy marshal of assault was dangerous enough. Suggesting it was connected to a broader conspiracy involving the territory's most powerful rancher was tantamount to signing their own death warrants. Before anyone could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed from the street. Through the window, they could see Bertram Sloane himself approaching with 20 riders, their brown dusters marking them as ranch hands, but their bearing suggesting something more military. Sloane rode a magnificent black stallion with the bearing of a man accustomed to getting his way. His silver-streaked beard was neatly trimmed, and his clothes were expensive, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a predator. He comes for the girl. Pike said, his voice tight with anxiety. Legal guardian, Henrik added with bitter understanding. Territorial law gives him authority over unmarried women in his employ. Then we'd better make sure she's not alone when he gets here, Dasan said, checking the loads in his Spencer carbine. As Sloane's riders formed a loose circle around the doctor's surgery, the four allies inside prepared for a confrontation that would determine not just Cora's fate, but the balance of power in a frontier town where justice and law didn't always mean the same thing. Evening painted sandstone bluff in shades of copper and gold, but the peaceful colors couldn't mask the coiled tension that had settled over the town. Sloane's demand for Cora's return had been met with Dr. Pike's professional refusal to release a patient who needed continued observation. The standoff had lasted 3 hours with neither side willing to back down. Miss Whitfield is recovering from serious injuries, Pike had told Sloane through the surgery window. As her physician, I'm recommending continued observation. Sloane's reply had been predictably direct, citing papers coerced from a friendly county judge letters that claimed wardship and power of attorney. I'm overruling your recommendation. The girl will receive proper care at my ranch, away from the corrupting influences she seems to have encountered in town. The corrupting influences clearly referred to Dasan and the growing alliance forming around Cora's protection. But as darkness fell, Sloane's men remained positioned around the building, effectively laying siege to the surgery. Inside, Cora had been listening to the exchange with growing resolve. The frightened Eastern girl who had stumbled bleeding from behind Garrett's store was being replaced by someone harder and more determined. Dr. Pike, she called through the window. I believe I'll take that walk you recommended for my recovery. It was a prearranged signal. While Pike continued his verbal sparring with Sloane, Cora slipped out the surgery's back door where Dasan waited with Henrik's buckboard wagon. The escape route led through a maze of back alleys that Dasan had scouted during the afternoon. They were nearly clear of town when one of Sloane's outriders spotted movement near the livery stable. The man's shout brought instant response, 20 horses wheeling in pursuit, while Sloane's bellow of rage echoed off the surrounding buildings. The chase erupted across the rolling prairie like a sudden thunderstorm. Henrik's mare was steady, but no match for the speed of Sloane's thoroughbreds, and the wagon's weight made swift maneuvering impossible. Within minutes, bullets began snapping through the air around them. Dasan rode wide, drawing fire, and using his Spencer carbine with careful precision. He wasn't trying to kill that would bring the territorial militia, but he could wound horses and discourage aggressive pursuit. The landscape ahead offered hope. Widow's Well, a narrow draw bordered by cottonwoods. The terrain would limit attackers while providing cover for defensive positions. But Henrik's wagon hit a hidden gopher hole just as they reached the draw. The left rear wheel cracked with a sound like breaking bones, nearly throwing Cora from her seat. This is not so good. Henrik cursed, wrestling with the reins, as Sloane's riders closed the final 100 yards. Dasan checked his ammunition and nodded grimly. "Can you hold them while I fix this wheel?" The battle that followed tested all their skills. Dasan used the cottonwoods for cover, making every shot count, while Henrik worked frantically to brace the broken wheel with a sturdy branch. Cora held the mare's reins and whispered calming words, despite the gunfire echoing around them. 3 weeks ago, I was teaching penmanship to bankers' children in Philadelphia, she said to Dasan between shots. "And now?" he asked, reloading. "Now I'm wondering why I ever thought that was enough." She smiled despite the danger. "Tell me something about your people. Something that will help me be brave." Dasan fired carefully, then glanced at her with surprise. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision that something else is more important than fear. What's more important right now? The future we're fighting for. When Henrik announced the wheel would hold, they resumed their flight at a slower pace. But as they approached the edge of Cheyenne territory, Sloane's men grew cautious. Attacking a lone wagon was one thing. Pursuing it into an area where they might face organized resistance was another. The pursuit finally broke off when smoke from cooking fires became visible on the horizon. "This ain't over, Whitfield," one of the riders called back. Sloane's got long arms and an even longer memory. As the threat receded, Cora allowed herself to sag against the wagon's side. But when Dasan rode close to check her condition, she managed a determined smile. "Thank you, both of you. You risked your lives for someone you barely know." Henrik shrugged. "A man must stand for something or he falls for everything. Besides, you got spine, worth the risk." Dasan was more direct. "You fought back against Miles. That took courage. Courage shared is strength doubled." As the wagon rolled into the Cheyenne camp near Green Valley, Cora realized she had found something unexpected on the frontier allies, who valued honor over convenience. The Cheyenne camp at Green Valley existed in careful balance between traditional ways and frontier necessity. 30 lodges were arranged in a protective circle near the creek, with horse herds grazing under the watchful eyes of young riders. Dasan's sister Winona emerged from her family's lodge as the damaged wagon rolled into camp. At 20, she possessed quiet strength that came from growing up, where survival depended on reading situations quickly. Her dark hair was braided with colored beads, and her doe-skin dress was decorated with porcupine quill work. "Brother," she said in Cheyenne, then switched to English. "You bring dangerous storms to our peaceful sky." Cora tried to dismount under her own power, but her ribs protested. She swayed, caught herself, and found Winona's steadying hand on her arm. "Sometimes storms clear the air," Dasan replied. This woman fights the same enemy who steals our horses and threatens our children. Winona studied Cora with frank assessment. What she saw was a young Eastern woman with obvious injuries, but also with calloused hands and steady eyes. The hands suggested familiarity with work, while the eyes held determination. "You are welcome at our fire," Winona said formally. "But understand, helping you may bring soldiers against our people." It was a fair warning. The territorial authorities had little patience with Indian communities that harbored fugitives. "I understand the risk," Cora replied. "I won't stay if my presence endangers your family, but I will find a way to repay this kindness." Winona's expression softened. Words are like morning mist. Actions are like the sun that burns it away. Over the next week, Cora proved the accuracy of her promise. Despite her injuries, she helped with camp tasks, demonstrating willingness to learn and adapt. She mended clothing with neat stitches, helped prepare meals without complaining about unfamiliar foods, and showed genuine interest in Cheyenne customs. But the peaceful interlude couldn't last. Sloane's response came in escalating waves. First was the water war. Green Valley Creek had always provided abundant water for both the Cheyenne camp and Henrik's farm downstream. But Sloane owned grazing rights to the upper watershed, and he exercised those rights ruthlessly. His men dynamited the natural stone weir that had regulated the creek's flow, sending a torrent downstream that washed away newly planted corn and left the lower reaches nearly dry. The second wave targeted the broader community. Coal Dust Mine, backed by Sloane's investment money, began experiencing mysterious accidents and labor troubles. When 3 men were injured in a tunnel collapse, whispers became angry murmurs. The third wave was personal and vicious. Dr. Pike was attacked while returning from a house call, beaten severely enough to require his own medical attention. Lucinda found her schoolhouse vandalized with threatening messages scrawled across the chalkboard. Henrik's prize milk cow was found shot in his barn. It was during this escalating campaign of terror that Cora made a decision that would change everything. "We need proof," she said one evening as they gathered in Dr. Pike's surgery. "Real evidence of what Sloane is doing, something a territorial court couldn't ignore." "What kind of proof?" Pike asked. "Documents, financial records, correspondence?" Cora's voice carried new steel. "The kind of evidence that's probably locked away in his private office at Crow Wing Ranch." The silence that followed was profound. Everyone understood what she was suggesting. "That's suicide," Henrik said finally. "The ranch is guarded, even if you could get inside." "Not during the day," Cora agreed. "But at night, when most of the hands are asleep, when there might only be 1 or 2 guards." Dasan studied her face in the lamplight. "You're serious about this?" "Dead serious. I've been thinking about it for days. Sloane keeps meticulous records. I saw that when I was working for him. A man that careful doesn't destroy evidence. He files it away where he thinks no one will ever find it." "Hooferf, and you think you can find these files?" "I know his office. I know where he keeps his safe, his filing cabinets, his private correspondence." She looked around the circle. "But I can't do it alone." The plan that emerged from their midnight council was desperate and dangerous. Cora would use her knowledge of the ranch layout and Sloane's habits, while Dasan would provide the skills needed to infiltrate a guarded compound without being detected. "If we're caught," Dasan began. "We won't be," Cora said firmly. "We can't be." 2 nights later, under a new moon that provided maximum darkness, they put their plan into action. The Crow Wing Ranch house squatted against the prairie like a fortress, its windows dark except for the faint glow from the main parlor where Sloane often worked late into the night. Outbuildings scattered around the main house provided cover for approach, but also concealed potential guards. Dasan moved like smoke through the darkness, his years of hunting and warfare serving him well in the shadows between buildings. Cora followed her lighter frame and knowledge of the terrain, allowing her to navigate obstacles he couldn't have anticipated. The first guard was asleep in the bunkhouse, his snores audible through the thin walls. The second was making rounds, but his pattern was predictable. Every 20 minutes, he walked a circuit that took him away from the main house for exactly 4 minutes. "There," Cora whispered, pointing to a window on the ranch house's north side. "That's his office. The window latch is broken. I noticed it when I was working there." The window opened silently, and they slipped inside. Just as the guard's footsteps faded around the corner of the building, Sloane's office was a testament to his empire. Maps of territorial land grants covered one wall, while filing cabinets lined another. A massive safe dominated the space behind his oak desk, its brass fittings gleaming in the dim light filtering through the windows. "The correspondence would be in the safe," Cora whispered. "But the financial records?" She moved to a filing cabinet marked Accounts Private. The drawer was locked, but years of frontier necessity had taught her basic skills that Philadelphia finishing school had never covered. The lock yielded to a hairpin, and patience revealing neat files organized by year and category. Cora's hands moved with swift precision, pulling documents that might prove Sloane's conspiracy. "Here," she breathed, holding up a leather ledger. "Payment to M. Garrett Special Services. Look at the amounts." Dasan studied the entries by moonlight. The payments were substantial, far more than a deputy marshal's salary could justify through legitimate work. But it was the correspondence they found in another drawer that provided the most damning evidence. Letters between Sloane and territorial officials in Deadwood Gulch detailed a complex scheme involving water rights, mineral claims, and legal guardianships. "Listen to this," Cora whispered, a reading from a letter marked with an official seal. "Your proposal regarding the Green Valley situation has merit. Colonel Morrison understands the necessity of complete pacification. Federal authorization can be arranged through appropriate channels." The words hit them like physical blows. This wasn't just about land seizure. Sloane was planning the complete extermination of the Cheyenne community to ensure no witnesses survived to contradict his version of events. "There's more," Cora said, her voice tight with horror. She held up another document, a military dispatch requesting cavalry support to deal with hostile Indian activity in the Green Valley area. It was dated for the following week and included a handwritten addition: "No survivors to contradict official report." They had found the evidence they needed, but the discovery came with a price. As Cora folded the documents and prepared to leave, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the hallway outside. "Someone's coming," Dasan whispered, moving toward the window. But before they could escape, the office door swung open and lamplight flooded the room. Bertram Sloane stood in the doorway, fully dressed despite the late hour, with Deputy Miles beside him and a rifle in his hands. Well, Sloane said with cold satisfaction. "Our little Eastern Rose has learned some frontier skills, breaking and entering theft, consorting with savages. Quite an education you've given yourself." Miles stepped into the room, his limp more pronounced in the confined space. "Should have minded your own business, girl. Should have taken what was offered and kept your mouth shut." Cora clutched the stolen documents against her chest, her mind racing through possible escape routes. The window was blocked by Sloane and the door by Miles. They were trapped. "You're going to hang for what you've planned," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Both of you." When the territorial authorities see these documents— "What documents?" Sloan asked with mock innocence. He nodded to Miles, who stepped forward with obvious relish. It was then that Dasan acted. Instead of trying to fight his way out an impossible task in the confined space, he grabbed the oil lamp from Sloane's desk and hurled it against the far wall. The glass shattered, spreading burning oil across the wooden floor and instantly transforming the office into an inferno. In the chaos that followed, as Sloane and Miles scrambled to avoid the spreading flames, Dasan and Cora dove through the window into the darkness beyond. They hit the ground running with shouts of alarm erupting from the ranch house behind them. Within seconds, the entire compound was stirring to life as hands rushed to fight the fire that was spreading to other parts of the building. "The horses!" Dasan gasped as they sprinted across the open ground toward the corrals where his stolen ponies were kept. But their escape route was blocked by Rick Harmon and 3 other gunmen who had been sleeping in the bunkhouse. The men were armed and alert, having been awakened by the commotion. "End of the line," Rick snarled, raising his weapon. Nowhere left to run. It was Cora who spotted their salvation. The fire from Sloane's office had spread to the hay barn, and the structure was beginning to collapse in a shower of sparks and burning debris. The chaos provided the distraction they needed. "When I say run," she whispered to Dasan, "head for the creek crossing. Don't look back." Before he could object, she stood up from their concealment behind a water trough and shouted at the top of her lungs, "Fire in the main barn." The whole place is going up. The alarm was taken up by voices throughout the compound as hands rushed to save valuable buildings and livestock. In the confusion, Dasan and Cora slipped away toward the creek, carrying with them the evidence that would expose Sloane's conspiracy. But their troubles were far from over. Behind them, the Crow Wing Ranch burned like a beacon against the night sky, and they could hear the sounds of organized pursuit. Sloane would throw everything he had into capturing them before they could reach safety. The race back to Green Valley tested both their endurance and their resolve. But as they splashed across the creek with dawn breaking over the eastern hills, Cora realized that something fundamental had changed. The frightened Eastern girl was gone forever, replaced by someone who had learned to fight for what mattered most. "We did it," she gasped as they reached the Cheyenne camp. "We actually did it." Dasan looked at her with something approaching awe. Her dress was torn and blackened with soot, her hair had come loose from its pins, and there was a determined glint in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Yes," he said quietly. "We did." The evidence Cora and Dasan had stolen from Sloane's office painted a picture of corruption that reached from the local level all the way to territorial government. But possessing the documents and being able to use them legally were 2 different things. They needed help from someone with authority and integrity, someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated. That someone turned out to be Deputy U.S. Marshal Jake Thompson, and the territorial law enforcement officer who had been making his way toward Sandstone Bluff for the past week, following up on Henrik and Dr. Pike's carefully worded reports about increasing tensions in the area. Thompson was a lean, weathered man in his 50s who had dealt with frontier violence for most of his adult life. When he arrived at the Cheyenne camp and was presented with the stolen documents, his reaction was immediate and professional. "This is solid evidence," he said after examining the papers. "More than enough to justify federal intervention. But there's a problem." "What kind of problem?" Dr. Pike asked. "The kind that comes with a man who's got nothing left to lose?" Thompson's face was grim. "My sources tell me Sloane's planning something desperate. Something that'll happen before these documents can be properly processed through legal channels." The something turned out to be more desperate than any of them had imagined. Instead of fleeing the territory or trying to destroy the remaining evidence, Sloan had decided to accelerate his timeline. If he couldn't eliminate his enemies quietly, he would create a crisis that would justify military intervention under his terms. The crisis began at dawn, 2 days later, when the workers at Coal Dust Mine arrived to find the facility surrounded by armed men. But these weren't Sloan's usual ranch hands. They were harder men professionals who had been recruited specifically for this operation. "What's happening?" Ezekiel Pratt, a young mine clerk, asked as he approached the facility with the morning shift. The answer came from Bitter Sam Sloan's most trusted gunman. "Emergency situation, boys. Indian trouble. We're here to protect you from hostile raids." But the protection quickly revealed itself as imprisonment. The miners were herded into the main facility and told they couldn't leave for their own safety. Guards were posted at all exits, and anyone who questioned the arrangement was met with loaded weapons and hostile stares. Word of the situation reached the Cheyenne camp by midday, carried by one of Henrik's farmhands who had witnessed the mine's occupation from a distance. "It's a trap," Dasan said immediately upon hearing the news. "Sloan's creating the crisis he needs to justify military intervention." Deputy U.S. Marshal Thompson nodded grimly. "He'll claim your people attacked the mine, took hostages. By the time federal troops arrive, he'll have all the evidence he needs to support his version of events." And the miners? Expendable. If some of them die in the Indian attack, it just makes his story more convincing. The plan was diabolical in its simplicity. Sloan would stage a fake Indian raid on the mine, leaving behind evidence that would justify massive military retaliation against the Cheyenne community. The surviving miners would become witnesses to Indian aggression, while any who might contradict the official story would be silenced permanently. "We have to stop him," Cora said, her voice carrying the steel that had been forged through weeks of conflict. "Those men are innocent. They don't deserve to die for Sloan's ambitions." "Agreed," Thompson replied. "But how the mine's in a natural amphitheater? No way to approach without being seen." It was Cora who provided the answer. "There is one way. The old silver workings connect to the coal tunnels about a quarter-mile underground. My father was a mining engineer. I learned to read survey maps when I was 12. The abandoned silver mine had been played out for 5 years, its tunnels considered too dangerous for regular use. But the maps in Sloan's stolen documents showed a connection to the newer coal workings, a passage that had been blocked off but never properly sealed. "The tunnels will be dark, dangerous, and probably unstable," Thompson warned. "One cave-in, and we're all dead. Better than letting innocent men die for a lie," Dasan replied. The rescue mission that followed would test their courage, skill, and determination to the absolute limit. The entrance to the abandoned silver mine was concealed by 5 years of brush growth and deliberately obscured by boards that had been placed to keep out curious children. Getting inside required careful work with crowbars and an acceptance that they might be walking into a death trap. The tunnel system was worse than they had expected. Water had seeped through cracks in the stone, creating treacherous footing and air that was thick with moisture and the smell of decay. Wooden support beams sagged ominously, and more than once they had to crawl under debris that had fallen from the ceiling. Cora led the way, using her knowledge of mining engineering to identify the safest routes through the maze of passages. Behind her came Dasan, his Spencer carbine, ready for whatever they might encounter. Deputy U.S. Marshal Thompson brought up the rear, his experience with underground fighting serving them well in the cramped conditions. "There," Cora whispered, pointing to a section of tunnel wall that had been bricked up with newer masonry. "That's the connection to the coal mine. Help me clear these bricks." Working in near silence to avoid detection, they removed enough of the barrier to create a passage barely wide enough for a single person. The space beyond was pitch black and filled with the sound of distant voices. "How many men up there?" Thompson asked, checking his weapons. "Too many to fight directly," Dasan replied. "But if we can reach the miners, get them organized." "Sloane's not going to give us time for organization." Cora interrupted. "Listen." From somewhere above them came the sound of shouting, followed by several gunshots. The fake Indian attack had begun. They emerged from the tunnel system into a storage area filled with mining equipment and explosives. The main facility was just overhead, and they could hear the sounds of simulated battle as Sloane's men carried out their theatrical assault. But the performance was more realistic than any of them had expected. Through cracks in the floorboards above, they could see armed men in war paint moving through the facility, firing weapons and shouting war cries. Several miners had already been wounded, their cries adding authenticity to the staged attack. "He's actually hurting them," Cora said, her voice tight with horror. "This isn't just theater. He's willing to kill innocent men to make his story convincing." The realization changed everything. This wasn't a rescue mission anymore. It was a race against time to prevent mass murder. The storage area where they'd emerged was directly beneath the main facility's central chamber where most of the miners had been gathered. But it was also where Sloane had positioned the bulk of his explosives, ready to bring down the entire structure once his Indian attack had served its purpose. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," Thompson breathed, staring at the cases of dynamite stacked around them. "He's planning to blow the whole place. Make it look like the Indians used explosives." "How long do we have?" Dasan asked. "Look at those fuses," Cora said, pointing to the carefully arranged charges. "They're already lit. Maybe 10 minutes before this whole place goes up." Above them, the sounds of battle were intensifying. Sloane's men were driving the miners toward the center of the facility, herding them like cattle toward slaughter. The plan was working exactly as designed, except for the 3 determined people working frantically in the basement to prevent mass murder. "Can you defuse those charges?" Thompson asked Cora. "Some of them, but not all, not in time." She studied the arrangement with an engineer's eye. "But if we can redirect the blast channel toward the outer walls instead of up into the main chamber." It was a desperate gambit that required split-second timing and more luck than any of them had a right to expect. While Cora worked to redirect the charges, Dasan and Thompson would have to fight their way upstairs and create enough chaos to disrupt Sloane's plan. "When this goes bad, and it will go bad, we scatter," Thompson instructed. "Get to the main chamber, get those miners out, however you can. Don't try to be heroes." "Too late for that advice," Dasan replied grimly. The battle that followed was unlike anything any of them had experienced. It began when Dasan and Thompson burst through the storage room floor into the main facility, their sudden appearance causing confusion among Sloane's men who weren't expecting opposition from below. The fake Indian attack dissolved into real combat as professional gunmen found themselves facing determined opponents who knew the truth about their operation. The miners, initially confused by the chaos, quickly realized they had allies and began fighting back with whatever weapons they could improvise. But it was Cora who turned the tide of battle. Working alone in the basement, she had successfully redirected enough of the explosive charges to prevent total building collapse. When the fuses finally reached their destination, the blast channeled outward and down, destroying the facility's outer walls, but leaving the central chamber largely intact. The explosion was still devastating. The main building shook like an earthquake. Wooden beams cracked and splintered, and a cloud of dust and debris filled the air so thickly that visibility dropped to mere inches. In the chaos that followed, with Sloan's men stunned by the unexpected blast pattern and the miners fighting for their lives, the confrontation's outcome remained in doubt, until Deputy U.S. Marshal Thompson's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Federal Marshal, drop your weapons, all of you." Through the dust and smoke came the sound of approaching horses, not Sloan's men, but a detachment of the U.S. cavalry from a nearby army post led by the federal authorities, who had finally responded to Thompson's urgent telegrams. The arrival of legitimate military force ended the fake Indian attack as abruptly as it had begun. Sloan's hired gunmen, faced with real soldiers rather than defenseless miners, quickly laid down their weapons and surrendered. But Sloan himself was nowhere to be found. The search for Bertram Sloan led through the wreckage of his empire like following a trail of destruction across the prairie. His ranch house gutted by the fire, Dawson had started yielded additional evidence of corruption, but no sign of the man himself. His accounts had been emptied, his livestock scattered, and his most trusted associates either dead or in custody. It was Ezekiel Pratt, the mine clerk, who had survived the attack, who provided the crucial information about Sloan's whereabouts. "He's holed up in the old mine shaft," Ezekiel told Deputy U.S. Marshal Thompson as they treated his injuries from the explosion. "The deep one where they used to extract silver before the vein played out. He's got maybe 6 men with him, including that devil Rick Harmon." The abandoned mine shaft was a quarter-mile from the main facility, connected by a narrow railway that had once carried ore cars between the extraction point and the processing plant. It was a natural fortress with only one entrance and walls of solid rock that could withstand a siege for weeks. But Sloan wasn't planning a siege. According to Ezekiel, he had enough explosives stored in the mine to bring down the entire mountain if necessary. His plan was simple. If he couldn't escape to enjoy his ill-gotten wealth, he would ensure that no one else survived to testify against him. "He's lost everything," Thompson observed as they studied the mine entrance from a safe distance. "A man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous kind." "So what do we do?" Dr. Pike asked. He had arrived with medical supplies to treat the wounded miners, but his concern extended beyond immediate injuries to the broader crisis. "We talk him out," Thompson replied. "Try to convince him that surrender is his best option." But talking required getting close enough to communicate, and the mine entrance was covered by rifles held by desperate men who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill. Several attempts to approach under a flag of truce had been met with gunfire. It was during the third failed attempt at negotiation that Cora made a decision that would define the rest of her life. "He'll listen to me," she said quietly. The statement caused immediate protests from everyone present. She was the primary target of Sloan's hatred, the person whose intelligence and courage had exposed his conspiracy. Approaching him directly was tantamount to suicide. "He won't shoot me immediately," she explained with calm logic. "He'll want to gloat to explain how clever he's been to blame me for ruining his plans. That's his weakness, his need to be understood and respected. And while he's talking, maybe someone with the right skills can get close enough to end this without more bloodshed." She looked directly at Dawson as she spoke, and he understood immediately what she was proposing. It was the same kind of desperate coordination that had served them during their escape from Crow Wing Ranch, but with stakes that couldn't be higher. "I don't like it," Thompson said bluntly. "Neither do I," Cora replied. "But I can't think of a better option. Can you?" The silence that followed was answer enough. An hour later, as the sun reached its zenith and cast harsh shadows across the mining complex, Cora walked slowly toward the mouth of the abandoned shaft. She carried no weapons, her hands visible and empty, but her spine was straight and her voice clear when she called out. "Bertram Sloan, I want to talk." The response came from deep within the mine, echoing off stone walls, until it seemed to come from the earth itself. "Miss Cora Whitfield, how thoughtful of you to visit. Come closer, my dear. We have so much to discuss." As she approached the mine entrance, moving with deliberate slowness to avoid provoking gunfire, Cora was acutely aware that everything depended on the next few minutes. Behind her, hidden among the mining equipment and debris, Dasan was moving into position for what might be their only chance to end the crisis without more bloodshed. "That's far enough," Sloane's voice commanded when she was 20 yards from the entrance. "Close enough to talk, far enough to ensure you won't try anything foolish." In the shadows of the mine entrance, she could see the outline of several men, their weapons trained on her, but their attention focused on the woman who had destroyed their carefully laid plans. "You've caused me considerable inconvenience." Sloane continued his voice, carrying the cold fury of a man whose empire had crumbled in a matter of days. "I hope you're proud of your achievements." "I'm proud of preventing mass murder." Cora replied, her voice steady despite the guns pointed at her. "I'm proud of exposing your conspiracy. I'm proud of standing up to a coward who hides behind hired guns and forged documents." "Coward." Sloane's laugh was harsh and bitter. "I built an empire from nothing. I turned wilderness into civilization, chaos into order. I was on the verge of controlling the entire Green Valley watershed when you and your savage friends interfered. You were on the verge of committing genocide for profit." Cora corrected. "There's nothing civilized about that." It was while Sloane was responding to this accusation, his voice rising with righteous indignation, that Dasan made his move. Using skills learned in a lifetime of hunting and warfare, he worked his way through the mining debris to a position where he could see into the entrance tunnel. What he saw made his blood run cold. Sloane and his remaining men were positioned around several cases of dynamite, the charges wired together and connected to a detonator that Sloane held in his hand. The rancher wasn't planning to surrender or escape. He was preparing to bring down the entire mine shaft, taking everyone within 100 yards with him. The realization changed everything. This wasn't a standoff that could be resolved through negotiation or tactical assault. It was a suicide mission that would claim dozens of lives, unless it could be stopped immediately. Moving with desperate silence, Dasan worked his way closer to the mine entrance, using shadows and debris for concealment. His Spencer carbine was loaded and ready, but a gunshot would likely trigger the explosion he was trying to prevent. He needed to get close enough for hand-to-hand combat, close enough to stop Sloane before the detonator could be activated. Meanwhile, Cora continued her dangerous game of words, keeping Sloane's attention focused on their conversation, while hoping that help was approaching from behind. "You could have been a legitimate businessman," she was saying. "You had the resources, the connections, and the intelligence. Why choose crime and violence?" "Because legitimate business is for men without vision," Sloane replied. "The weak, the timid, the ones who accept limits imposed by law and custom. I saw the potential of this territory, the wealth that could be extracted from its land and resources. I wasn't going to let legal technicalities prevent me from claiming what I deserved." "What about the people who were already here?" "The Cheyenne community, the farmers like Henrik, the miners who worked for you." "Obstacles. Resources to be used or removed as necessary." Sloane's voice carried the cold calculation that had characterized all his business dealings. "Sentiment is a luxury that successful men can't afford." It was then that Rick Harmon, positioned as a lookout near the mine entrance, spotted movement among the debris. His shout of alarm shattered the tense negotiation. "Boss company behind us." The warning came just as Dasan made his final approach. Instead of trying to remain hidden, he broke into a sprint covering the last 20 yards to the mine entrance, while Sloane's men scrambled to respond to the unexpected threat. What followed was a desperate struggle in the confined space of the tunnel mouth. Dassan's tackle knocked Sloane away from the detonator, but Rick Harmon was already raising his rifle. Cora, instead of fleeing to safety, threw herself forward to help, grabbing a piece of mining equipment to use as a weapon. The fight was brief but decisive. Sloane, surprised by the sudden assault, lost his grip on the detonator as he fell. Rick's shot went wide, the bullet striking stone and sending sparks flying. Before he could fire again, Dassan's knife found its mark, and the gunman collapsed without another sound. The remaining men, seeing their leader down and their escape route blocked by approaching a detachment of the U.S. cavalry from a nearby army post, surrendered without further resistance. As Deputy U.S. Marshal Thompson and his men secured the prisoners, Cora knelt beside the detonator that could have killed them all. Her hands shook slightly as she examined the device, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "It's safe now. The charges are disconnected." Dassan, breathing hard from the fight, but uninjured, looked at her with something approaching awe. "You didn't run. When the shooting started, you came to help instead of running to safety." "We're partners," she said simply. "Partners don't abandon each other when things get dangerous." It was, he realized, a perfect summary of everything they had learned about each other during their weeks of conflict and cooperation. They were no longer the frightened Eastern teacher and the cautious Cheyenne trader who had first met in Sandstone Bluff. They had become something stronger and more valuable. Two people who could face any challenge together. Bertram Sloane, his empire destroyed and his conspiracy exposed, was taken into custody to await trial for conspiracy, fraud, assault, and attempted mass murder. His conviction was a foregone conclusion, given the mountain of evidence and the testimony of dozens of witnesses. But the legal resolution was almost anticlimactic compared to the personal victory that Cora and Dassan had achieved. They had not only survived a deadly conspiracy, but had proven themselves capable of building something better from the ashes of corruption and violence. 6 months later, Green Valley had transformed into something neither traditional Cheyenne nor typical frontier settlement, but a unique community that combined the best elements of both cultures. The crisis had forged bonds that proved stronger than racial prejudice or cultural misunderstanding. Henrik Dahl's farm had become a model of cooperation using both European agricultural techniques and traditional Cheyenne land management practices. His irrigation system, rebuilt with help from the entire community, was more efficient than anything that had existed in the valley before. Dr. Pike's surgery had expanded to serve patients from both communities, and his practice had attracted attention from territorial medical authorities who were interested in his integrated approach to frontier healthcare. Lucinda Park had established a school that served children from both white and Cheyenne families, creating an educational program that emphasized cooperation and mutual respect, while teaching both traditional academic subjects and practical frontier skills. The legal aftermath of Sloane's conspiracy had resulted in the redistribution of his assets to compensate his victims and provide capital for new enterprises. Water rights were formally recognized, grazing disputes were resolved through negotiation rather than violence, and the territorial government had implemented new oversight procedures to prevent similar corruption in the future. But the most significant change was visible every evening when Cora and Dassan walked together along the creek that had become a symbol of their community's prosperity. The water ran clear and strong, no longer threatened by upstream diversion or downstream pollution. Their wedding, celebrated in the manner that had become traditional in Green Valley, brought together the entire community regardless of race or background. Henrik provided music on his fiddle. Winona led the women in preparing a feast that combined culinary traditions, and Dr. Pike performed the ceremony in his capacity as the community's informal spiritual leader. Deputy U.S. Marshal Thompson, who had remained in the area to oversee the final resolution of Sloane's case, offered a toast that captured the significance of what they had accomplished to Cora and Dasan, who proved that justice and love can triumph over greed and hatred. And to all of you who showed that people of different backgrounds can build something stronger together than any of them could manage alone. As evening settled over Green Valley, bringing with it the sounds of celebration and community, Cora found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The frightened Eastern girl who had stepped off the freight wagon seemed like a different person entirely, someone she could barely remember being. "No regrets?" Dasan asked, echoing a question from their first desperate days together. "None at all," she replied, and the words carried deeper meaning than they ever had before. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, the same stars that had witnessed their first alliance, and now shone down on their hopeful future. In the distance, the lights of their community gleamed like earthbound constellations, each representing a family, a dream, a small victory over the forces that sought to divide and destroy. Children from both communities played together in the fading light, their laughter carrying across the water like music. Adults from different backgrounds worked side by side to clean up after the celebration, their easy cooperation a testament to bonds forged in crisis and strengthened in peace. An elderly Cheyenne grandmother began telling stories to the gathered children, her voice weaving tales of courage and wisdom that bridged cultures. Nearby, Henrik was teaching young Cheyenne men about water wheel design, while Winona showed Norwegian women how to weave baskets strong enough to last for years. The story that had begun with violence and fear had ended with love and hope, proving that even in the harshest places, people of goodwill could build something beautiful and lasting. It was a lesson worth remembering, a truth worth defending, and a foundation strong enough to support whatever the future might bring. As they walked back toward their new home, hands linked and hearts full, the sounds of their community celebration followed them through the evening air. Laughter and music, conversation and contentment. The simple but profound sounds of people who had found their place in the world and intended to keep it. Behind them, Green Valley Creek continued its ancient flow, carrying away the debris of past conflicts while nourishing the seeds of future growth. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as all tomorrows did, but they would face them together as partners, as community, as proof that courage and love could indeed triumph over hatred and greed. The echo of Henrik's fiddle drifted across the water, playing an old song with new hope, carrying a message that would outlast any empire built on violence and deception. Home was not a place you conquered, but a place you earned through service sacrifice. And standing beside those who shared your values when standing was the hardest thing you could do. Note, charges were set with blasting caps and slow fuses timed by hand without any electrical apparatus.